Okay, so what I've done recently is I've tried incorporating ink into my work. I just wanted to test out the medium rather than just use acrylic paint, specifically because I noticed in inks, colored inks, the vibrancy and the saturatedness of the colors is very strong. And when trying to communicate emotions, I feel like vibrant colors are very integral to communicating vibrant emotions. I would say I connect those two things together very much so. Vibrancy and strong emotion, intensity of color and intensity of emotions. So when I started working with inks on a new canvas, I noticed when adding water to it so that the inks would go across the whole surface, it toned down the saturation, which I didn't like. And on one hand, it helped because it helped spread out the ink across the whole surface, whereas if I didn't add any water, not a lot of the surface would be covered. However, it feels wasteful to spread the ink all over the whole surface if the color is not going to be coming through as I intended it to. So I tried other ways to show that color by not adding any water to it and just moving it around on the canvas. And the leftover pieces of ink I had on my brush, I tried splatting it on the canvas. And I noticed that particularly still had some saturation. The splashes of color had saturation, which I liked. And when I was layering the different layers of ink on top of each other, that made the surface look less flat. But I think it still looked flat to an extent because there was no texture. So I questioned how could I create texture or less of that flatness with ink on canvas. So I applied different kinds of paints on top of the surface which was already covered with ink, and I let it dry and then thought of putting ink on top of that textured paint surface, which ideally would be transparent, so you could still see the ink underneath the layer of transparent paint on top of that layer. The layeredness of the inks did help make it look less flat, but yeah, I just didn't like how it still looked flat to an extent. I also tried to use iteration. How do I phrase myself? I tried to iterate some processes that I used in the painting long core workshop into this ink painting experiment by using string and trying to create marks with it by putting it on top of the canvas whilst the paint is dry, I mean wet, and I left it for a whole day. But when I returned to it, it was it left no marks. This could be because the surface wasn't wet enough when I put the string onto the surface, so trying to leave a mark behind on that surface with that resembled the string pattern. But it was already fairly wet, so I doubt that I can create marks through stamping things onto the surface whilst it's wet. I could, however, create stamps on the surface using ink that is saturated. It's a huge negative for me to work with saturated ink with no water, because that would require me to work very fast in creating the shapes I want whilst the ink is on the surface. And it can appear very splodgy sometimes, if that makes sense. So I did consider wetting a shape or said surface where I want the paint to be before painting that surface, so that the paint would spread where the water has already laid down. However, this wasn't ideal or perfect either, though it did slightly help, because where there are elements of water, and even if there are no water elements, the ink spreads unevenly, which I find frustrating. I'm not sure how to spread the ink evenly, whether I add water to the ink or not. Whether I wet the surface beforehand or not. Whether the surface I'm trying to cover in is huge or small. Okay, that's a lie. If the surface is small, then it is easier to cover that in with saturated ink only, and if the surface is bigger, then it's almost impossible to cover the whole surface evenly with ink. On one hand, because the ink doesn't spread evenly, that could remove the flat look. But there is a lack of control in where those ink splodges go, which is undesirable. I want to have control over where the ink is going. I have already attempted to put ink on top of acrylic, and I mixed the ink with water, and this resulted the acrylic paint underneath to become very mushy. It changed shape. I wanted it to look wrinkly, and it did, but in a way that didn't look 3D. It was, I don't know. Well, not 3D. Because it was 3D, but flat 3D. Just show an image. Just show an image of it. However, if we're going to talk about my work overall, then another thing I've attempted to do is record people playing ping pong or other kinds of sports to capture dynamic poses that are present while they play a game. I wanted to try out different filters or camera lenses to put on the camera with which to record the ping pong or other sports games. This is so that the poses that are captured could what? Look more dynamic. This is so that the poses through these distorted lenses could become or appear more dynamic or energetic. However, I'm aware that if there is too much distortion, that could take away from the emotiveness seen in the pose. The fisheye lens specifically is what I'm interested in using for this, and a process of iteration that I have done is I went and recorded ping pong videos, people playing ping pong, including myself, and I intentionally tried to make dynamic poses whilst playing the game. However, I'm aware that while capturing casual ping pong players, that didn't really create that much of a dynamic posing. People didn't look dynamic enough in my opinion, so I considered one way I could make the poses look more dynamic is to go to a ping pong club where the people playing there are more skilled, meaning their poses would be more dynamic, hopefully. Additionally, I noticed that when trying to draw the poses of the people I captured playing ping pong casually, I couldn't make out the poses and the human anatomy of the pose because the baggy clothes were obstructing a lot of the human anatomy and the muscles, and that wasn't a good point of reference at that point. I have tried to use a wide angle, what's it called? Wide angle lens? However, this seemed to look identical to the normal camera lens. It just added a Vigenite on the sides of the frame, but it didn't appear very warped at all. To help with the music production side of my project, I invited an external visitor into the sound studios, which was skilled in music making, to help compose music for me. At the day of recording, what happened was I was showing them images of my artworks so that they would interpret them in their own way, but I also told them what the image was and what it meant, from which I wanted them to make music so that they could accurately represent the artwork through the music. And instead of telling them what note to make and exactly how, although I still was guiding and orchestrating them, I allowed them to experiment, and then based off of what they made, I would decide if I liked it or not. But the guiding that I was giving to them, I essentially told them by using the music references for inspiration. I picked out like different elements that I liked from those things, and I suggested things that they could use to create a certain atmosphere. So we went more so off of the feeling of the artwork and trying to recreate the feeling of it rather than create a specific tune and melody. The staff member at hand helped us navigate through the program Ableton Live. And gave us some beats, some drums. They added some effects that I wanted, specifically reverb and echo, to make the instrument sound ethereal in the program. However, the person was playing on a guitar in real time. So I do have recordings of the guitar, whilst on the program it appears distorted to appear more ethereal. When listening over the tracks that were produced, I noticed that I really didn't like the reverb and echo part of some of the recordings, because it sounded as if the echo and reverb were creating their own tune on top of the tune that the guitar was already making, whilst I just wanted one tune to be heard. The echo wasn't supposed to make its own tune or layer on top of the tune already made. I just wanted it to extend the noise, to sound long. But there were some elements where the reverb did sound alright, and it was more calm. It wasn't maybe too loud. I'm not sure. Okay, but back to the ping pong thing. I used these references. I made my own references because I already explained that it would be difficult to find references online. And I did attempt to find references online, actually, of fisheye lens perspective of people playing ping pong. I even used AI for it to tell me and show me images shot through a fisheye lens perspective of people playing ping pong, and I looked at all the sources that it gave me, and even though I repeatedly asked it over and over to show me the actual thing, because when I looked at the sources, it wasn't showing me anything. It redirected me to good photographs of people playing ping pong. However, it wasn't done through a fisheye lens perspective, which is specifically what I wanted. So, turns out I actually have to record and make my own references. But the reason why I'm using these references is because I want to, and this is another way I've done iteration, is instead of just using the poses that I've drawn from my imagination as being my artwork, I want to refine my poses so that I have specific poses that I will draw on the canvas so that they are as humanly accurate as is possible for my skill level, at least. Or maybe not as much, but I would prefer the poses to be realistic over depending on my imagination to depict the running cycle and then jumping and flying into space. Although I believe that I can, out of imagination, draw emotive poses, I would like to be more specific in those emotive poses and drawing them what they are realistically. I think to an extent it doesn't matter, but I would like to try and see the differences. I will be comparing what the poses look like if they're just drawn from imagination, if maybe some of them are drawn from imagination and just some of them are actual real references. On one hand, I know I can't, I think I already talked about this, I can't make references of things that are impossible to make references of, like a person flying, for example, but I can imagine what the pose of someone energetically flying could look like, and the closest thing I could try to find of a reference to that pose is maybe people jumping in sports, like people who do athletics. So I could also reference online images of people jumping. However, for the walking and running part of the cycle, I believe I will be using possibly ping pong references, maybe football references, because I noticed that people playing ping pong, their poses somewhat look as if they're running, but not entirely. So I could use the ping pong poses as a initial pose of where the person is starting to run or almost running, so it looks like a build-up. Yep. So I'll be using references from different kinds of sports, and then I'll just play around with the positioning of the poses on a piece of paper, and then when I find a composition of poses that I like, I will put it on the canvas. And yeah, I didn't talk about this yet. I will iterate the expressive, abstract art used in the painting workshop as a part of my studio work by using it as a background. So I also thought about making my background look something similar to like a light tunnel. I don't know what it's called, so that it further makes the person look like they are running fast. So I could make the background aid the sense of motion that is happening in the narrative. You can reference Scott McCloud right here because there's a part in that book where it talks about like driving in a car, and then if the camera is focused on the car so it's moving alongside the car, it makes the background look different, similar to like a light tunnel. I don't know the phrase for it, but you can reference that part of the book to explain that. And this is also used in comics. These are motion lines. So I could use motion lines in the background to further convey that movement. However, that is not the focus. The focus is conveying the emotions behind the narrative of the running. And also maybe making it look Christian related. And this is where the interview with Nicholas becomes relevant, because I was asking him about like, what do you think Christian art like looks like? What makes something Christian art? Like, what are the elements that would make it recognizable as Christian art? Yeah, so go back to that conversation and take out the relevant points from it. I also went ahead and tried to develop the painting, the collaborative painting from the painting workshop because I noticed that after I put the canvas on a frame, it appeared different. The work had a different look to it because the borders were more noticeable. And there are some artworks where I notice the border doesn't interfere with the artwork, but in this case I felt like the edges of the canvas were somewhat restrictive of the energy that was seen in the work that was going outwards in every direction. So I didn't like that. So I wanted to I had a thought to extend the artwork underneath the canvas by making it appear as if there were splashes of paint coming outside of the canvas, so outside of the borders. But because I can't paint on the wall, I thought of a way that I could make splashes of paint go on the wall in a way that it wouldn't go on the wall, but it would look like it was on the wall. That is by sticking a bunch of pieces of paper together and then splashing ink, or not ink, but paint on it. And then putting tracing paper on top of that to then outline every mark, then put the tracing paper with the marks underneath the layer of paper which had splashes on it, and then I would cut out all the pieces, like remove the parts of the paper where there are no marks of paint, and then the little pieces of paint that appears sprayed, I would, you know, like the little dots that, oh my days. So when you do a splash of paint, it creates a lot of dots. Like, it's not like the whole piece of paint, it's all touching each other. Like, there's little bits that are outside of the main body of paint, which makes it look like it's sprayed. So I wanted to capture each and every individual, like, sprayed dot in the exact position that it originally was on the piece of paper, instead of just like that insert artist reference, unlike them, which move them around on the wall to have whatever composition they want. I want it to be the exact same composition as it was on the paper. So I would just cut out each of those circles or blobs of paint and stick them onto the tracing paper where I have outlined each of them, and then I would just stick the tracing paper on the wall where I want the splashes to be on the wall around the work, around the canvas, and then I would just under the layer of tracing paper glue with maybe glue tack or some other substance that temporarily attaches paper to the surface. I would just put it where the outlined circles are on the tracing paper, so that they are in the exact same spot that they were on the paper, except that they're cut out. And yeah, that's what I wanted to do. And I believe this would make the artwork appear more engaging or more visually grabs more attention, because one, it's bigger, and two, the colors would be grabbing the attention of the person, I believe. And it's on the wall, like, wall art is very, I don't know. So it would be almost like a mural art, but the mural part of the artwork is an extension of the canvas part of the artwork, because I feel like the canvas itself is the framing of it. Keeps the artwork closed. It's not open. I want the artwork to look open and engaging rather than closed off or limited. Yes, potential is not limited, and that's the theme of my work. So I want that potential to be expressed through the artwork literally exploding outside of itself, by the artwork literally expanding. So the artwork looks like it is expanding outwards, like, and would be fitting with the theme of potential and growth. Regarding booking out a studio space in which to play this music and experiment how the sound could travel and what effect I want audibly, I have found out that all the project spaces have now been booked out, so I could book out a project space to exhibit at the start of the next year, which is disappointing. So I was told the only other space I can use is the space in the studio to experiment with different sounds, or at least what I had in mind for experimenting with sounds is perhaps using multiple speakers and playing something different from each speaker so that it would create an audible immersion for the viewer. However, I'm not sure how to make that happen, so I will be emailing Bevis to discuss that with them and see if there is any other way that I can create layers of sound outside of using speakers. One thing I discussed during the one-to-one/group tutorial is that I am aware that, let's say I exhibit my artwork and there's audio playing in the background. I'm aware that there will be people who will come in and out of the space rather quickly, and they won't have time to listen to the whole audio piece, which is why I've been questioning and unsure about how long this piece of music should be, because I've noticed in exhibition spaces, if there is background audio, it's often on repeat and it doesn't vary much in changing audibly. It has like the same structure replayed over and over, and there's no variety in it, which isn't really what I'm looking for with my work, considering I've already decided to make the music I'm working on tell a narrative, which would require the person to listen to the audio for some time, definitely much more than a couple of seconds. But I could, I suppose, make the target audience be the person that does stick around my exhibition and doesn't leave immediately. So I guess I could make the work assuming that at least one person will stay there to listen for longer than a couple of seconds. So in terms of that, considering this, I could keep the audio track shorter, however not too short, before having this thought, I was considering having the music be maybe 5 minutes long, but now I'm considering cutting it down to 1 or 2 minutes. So I would have to bargain with myself a compromise, maybe between 5 and 1 minute. So 3 minutes may be the right in between. And I'd have to figure out a good transition between the end of the song and the first song, because I will want it to loop, I think. Because if people can enter into the space at any time, then ideally I would want them to experience the sound part of the work too. However, this could this would remove the censor part of my idea, so I would have to clarify if my plan of a motion sensor activating sound, if that will work in the first place. If the sound is dependent on someone's proximity to the artwork, then I don't think speakers could work. I mean, they could, but I'm not sure if they would work how I want them, and if there are speakers in front of the artwork, then that would make it more obvious that there should be sound coming out of them. Whereas if it's only a motion sensor, then the person would be somewhat maybe surprised by the presence of music appearing as they step toward it, toward the artwork. And I'm not sure if I want that surprise or not. But when it comes to the length of the music, I believe that if the music is longer, there is more opportunity to develop a narrative within the music as opposed to 1 minute. So I believe narrative is more important in my artwork over it being short and repetitive and having a constant, which I believe would make the artwork boring to an extent, but at the same time it could interrupt the process of viewing the artwork, this engagement with the audible part of our senses. So the music could distract from the artwork as well, I am aware. And in that case, having a more quieter and constant background music would be better to keep the focus on the artwork by having the music subtly influence our interpretation of it, rather than the music being in your face. I could maybe negotiate an in-between, try and find that sweet spot maybe between a constant, almost boring music and a longer narrative piece that has some emotion and dynamicness to it. Because I don't think I want the artwork to be, I mean the music to be monotone and the same. I think that is the last option I will be taking within this project regarding my music. I think that is my last resort if all the other possibilities don't work out. There will be a lot of iteration within the music part of this project, I believe, as well, considering post-production of music is different to the live process of playing music in the moment. So I've already attempted at making music outside of the live studio on a random online free software or online browser or website that just allows you to make music. And this was for experimentation purposes only. I wasn't actively trying to make the song that or the tune align with my artwork. I was simply just trying to play around with creating sound digitally outside of the studio for fun. Insert YouTube video that is relevant. However, when attempting post-production in Ableton Live in the surround studio in Bank Plain, my lack of familiarity with that software was really frustrating, and I felt like I couldn't do as much post-production as I wanted. I tried to today use the MIDI keyboard that was in the studio and play it. However, I believe I'm not very skilled in playing instruments live, so I found it much easier to make the tune and melody of the keyboard digitally and change it on the program as opposed to playing it directly on the keyboard on the instrument. So there will be a lot of iteration in that.